It caused $10 million in damage in an age when a dollar was a fortune. And when it was over, the fourth largest city in the United States was on its knees. On May 27, 1896, more than 250,000 people lived and worked in the booming heart of St. Louis, Missouri. They built bridges, packed tobacco, and loaded freight on the busiest river in North America. Their entire world was built on a single assumption. Progress, one storm, in less than 20 minutes, proved that assumption wrong. The city lost at least 255 of its citizens. Thousands were left without a home. It was a catastrophe that arrived with no warning, from a direction they were told was impossible, carrying a force that science itself had forbidden its own forecasters from even naming. So the real question is, did St. Louis just suffer a random act of God? Or did the city, in all its industrial pride, come face to face with a power it had fatally underestimated? A lot of you who watch these stories tell us you get so caught up in them, you forget to subscribe. And honestly, our subscription rate for how many people watch these videos is dangerously low. If you believe this history is important, if you think these deep dives matter, then you have to subscribe. It takes 1 second. It's the single most important thing you can do to make sure we can keep making them. So push the button. Now, let us know in the comments, what is the worst storm you have ever personally witnessed? Let's begin. St. Louis was never supposed to be vulnerable. In 1896, the city was the embodiment of American industrial certainty. The fourth largest metropolis in the nation, trailing only New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia. It was a city of brick and iron and ambition. A continental crossroads where the power of the railroad met the commerce of the Mississippi River. Its air was thick with coal smoke. Its streets loud with the construction of a future that seemed limitless. This was not a fragile frontier town. This was a center of power, a monument to the Gilded Age belief that humanity was taming the continent, one steel beam at a time. And the science of the era agreed. Meteorology in the late 19th century was a field in its infancy, a young discipline struggling to be taken seriously. The U.S. Weather Bureau, which had only recently taken over forecasting duties from the Army Signal Corps, operated under a peculiar and deadly restriction. For years, its superiors had officially banned the word tornado from any public forecast. The logic, as strange as it sounds today, was that using the word would incite panic. They believed it was better for the public to be uninformed than for them to be afraid. Warning systems did not exist. There was no alert, no siren, no radio bulletin. You only knew it was coming when you saw it, or when you heard it. On the morning of Wednesday, May 27, 1896, there was no reason to be afraid. The day dawned warm and muggy, a typical late spring day in the Mississippi Valley. But by mid-afternoon, the mood of the sky began to shift. The air grew heavy. Thick, bruised-looking clouds massed on the western horizon, and the barometric pressure began to drop with an unnatural speed. In a home near Lafayette Park, a barometer would later record a dizzying plunge to 26.74 inches of mercury, an impossibly low reading. Then the sky turned a sickly, unsettling shade of green, a color that anyone who has lived in the Midwest instinctively recognizes as a prelude to violence. And then came the sound. A low rumble at first, then a deafening roar that blotted out every other noise in the city. It was the sound of a mile-wide column of air moving at unimaginable speed. At just after 5 o'clock in the evening, 6 miles west of the city's iconic Eads Bridge, the thing they were not allowed to name touched the ground. The destruction began instantly. The tornado carved a path up to a mile wide as it moved east, directly into the dense southern portion of St. Louis. It did not skirt the edges of the city. It aimed for the heart. It chose downtown. One of the first significant landmarks to feel its full fury was Lafayette Park. This was not just a park. It was a 36-acre jewel, a historic public square surrounded by the elegant townhouses of the city's elite. It was a place of old-growth trees, manicured gardens, and heavy, ornate iron fencing that stood as a symbol of Victorian permanence. In minutes, it became a wasteland. The tornado did not just break the trees. It scoured them from the earth, leaving behind a forest of splintered stumps. But it was the fences, that told the real story of the forces at play. Forged, heavy iron bars, designed to stand for a century, were twisted and contorted by the cyclonic winds until they resembled tangled string. They were bent back on themselves, ripped from their stone footings, and woven into unrecognizable shapes. The sight was so baffling, so contrary to the known properties of iron, that it became one of the defining images of the storm's supernatural seeming power. It was a quiet, chilling testament to a force that could bend the very materials of civilization. From Lafayette Park, the vortex churned eastward. It fell upon City Hospital, a massive complex at 18th Street and Lafayette Avenue. This was the city's primary public health institution, a sprawling collection of brick buildings meant to be a place of healing and refuge. The storm turned it into a death trap. Walls collapsed. Roofs were torn away. Entire wards filled with patients were exposed to the sky and then buried under tons of rubble. The very place people would be brought for care after the disaster was itself one of the first major casualties. The place designed to save lives was now taking them. Drop a comment if you've ever imagined your local hospital being the epicenter of a disaster, not the solution. Just blocks away, a different kind of horror was unfolding at the Liggett Myers tobacco factory, which was still under construction. As the sky darkened and the roar grew, workers on the site scrambled for safety. Many of them ran to the one place that seemed secure, the basement. They huddled together underground, listening to the storm rage above them, believing they had found shelter. They were wrong. The tornado hit the unfinished structure with its full power. The massive iron framework of the factory, tons of steel and rivet, buckled and then collapsed inward, pancaking down into the very basement where the workers had taken refuge. Safety became a tomb. The heavy skeleton of the building they were helping to create crushed them. Multiple men died there, their final moments spent in what should have been the safest place to be. It was a brutal lesson in the physics of a storm that powerful. Survival wasn't about being sheltered. It was about being lucky. The tornado's path was a catalog of urban collapse. Over 311 buildings were completely obliterated. More than 7,200 were heavily damaged. Homes, churches, saloons, factories, theaters, all of them torn apart in a matter of minutes. But the storm was now approaching the single greatest symbol of St. Louis's engineering pride. A structure that was not just a bridge, but a declaration. It was heading for the Mississippi River, and for the one man-made object in the entire city that was famously, publicly, declared to be tornado-proof. The Eads Bridge was the soul of 1896 St. Louis. It was the masterwork of a man named James Buchanan Eads, a self-taught engineering genius who had made his fortune salvaging shipwrecks on the Mississippi. Eads was a force of nature in his own right, a man who saw problems on a scale others could not comprehend and devised solutions that seemed impossible. The bridge that bore his name, completed in 1874, was his crowning achievement. It was the first bridge of any kind to cross the Mississippi at St. Louis. More importantly, it was the first major bridge in the world built primarily with steel, using massive steel arches in a way no one had ever dared. It was revolutionary. It was audacious. And Eads had made a specific, bold claim about its strength. He had watched the river's power, he had studied the Midwest's violent weather, and he designed his bridge to withstand anything. It was, his company advertised, tornado-proof. A structure so solid, so perfectly engineered, it would stand against the worst winds the plains could produce. For 22 years, that claim held. The bridge became a national icon, a symbol that American ingenuity could conquer any natural obstacle. On May 27, 1896, that claim was put to the test. The tornado did not sweep the bridge away. That is not what happened. The core structure, the great steel arches that James Eads had sunk into bedrock, held firm. They withstood the vortex. But the storm did not need to destroy the bridge to destroy its myth. It chose to violate it instead. As the tornado crossed the river, it ripped away over 300 feet of the wooden and iron eastern approach to the bridge in Illinois, tearing a huge gap that rendered it unusable. The bridge was still standing, but it was severed from the land. But that wasn't the detail that would be remembered. That wasn't the part that would be talked about for 100 years. The truly shocking event happened on the main span of the bridge itself. The winds were moving so fast that they had transformed the debris of the city into a storm of high-velocity projectiles, and one of those projectiles found the tornado-proof bridge. It was a wooden plank, a simple piece of construction lumber, measuring 2 inches thick and 10 inches wide. Fired by the wind, that plank struck a solid 5/16 of an inch thick wrought iron plate that was part of the bridge's superstructure. It did not bounce off. It did not break. It went straight through. The plank punched a clean, clear hole through solid iron, driving through the metal like a bullet through paper before shattering on the other side. Think about that. The aerodynamic force was so immense, so perfectly focused, that it turned a piece of wood into an armor-piercing round. This single, visceral image did more to communicate the storm's power than any statistic. The tornado-proof bridge had been pierced. The illusion of perfect, man-made security was shattered by a splinter of wood. The impossible had happened. If you found that detail as shocking as we did, take a second to hit the like button. And if you have family who lives in a storm-prone area, share this with them. The lessons from 1896 are still relevant. The storm had proven its point in St. Louis, but it was not finished. For a generation, a persistent myth had taken root in the American Midwest. The belief that large, powerful rivers like the Mississippi acted as a kind of protective barrier against tornadoes. People genuinely believed that a major twister could not or would not cross a body of water that wide. It was a piece of comforting folklore in a land of violent weather. The Great St. Louis tornado destroyed that myth forever. After crippling the Eads Bridge, the vortex, undeterred, moved directly across the half-mile wide expanse of the Mississippi River. Witnesses on the riverfront described a horrifying sight, the river's surface being sucked upward into the funnel, the water itself seeming to boil. As the tornado reached the Illinois side, it slammed into East St. Louis, and it did something terrifying. It seemed to contract, its energy tightening, its winds intensifying. While the official rating for the entire storm path is an F4 on the Fujita scale, many modern meteorologists who have studied the damage patterns in East St. Louis argue that what happened there was virtually indistinguishable from an F5. The damage became absolute. East St. Louis in 1896 was a grittier, more industrial city than its neighbor across the river. It was a city of rail yards, factories, and working-class homes. The buildings were often less substantial, the population denser in the areas that were hit. The tornado showed no mercy. Entire neighborhoods were not just damaged, they were swept clean from their foundations. The epicenter of the devastation in Illinois was the Vandalia Railroad freight yards. This sprawling complex of tracks, warehouses, and railcars took a direct, catastrophic hit. The winds tossed multi-ton freight cars around like toys, twisting them into scrap metal and piling them into enormous heaps. At least 35 people were killed in the rail yards alone, crushed by flying debris or collapsing structures. The destruction here was so complete, so total, that it looked less like the aftermath of a storm and more like a battlefield. And still, that is not the storm's darkest secret. The official death toll, the number cited in history books for over a century, is 255 people, 137 in Missouri, 118 in Illinois. It is a precise number. It feels final. It is also wrong. The true number is almost certainly much higher, and the reason why lies in the river itself. The St. Louis riverfront in 1896 was home to a large, transient population that the official city census often missed. These were steamboat workers, deckhands, and poor families living on a flotilla of makeshift shanty boats moored along the banks. They lived on the water, their lives tied to the rhythms of the Mississippi. When the tornado hit the river, it obliterated this floating community. The shanty boats were smashed into kindling, their occupants thrown into the churning, debris-filled water. How many died? No one knows. Their bodies were not recovered from a collapsed building. They were swept downstream, carried away by the powerful current of the Mississippi River, their deaths unrecorded, their names unknown. They became the ghost victims of the Great Cyclone. They are the invisible part of the death toll, a permanent reminder that the storm's true cost can never be fully calculated. The Chicago Tribune, writing just 2 days later, understood this grim reality. In all probability, the paper wrote, The exact number of those whose lives were crushed out by falling walls, or who met their fate under the waters of the raging Mississippi, will never be known. The storm lasted less than half an hour. By 5:30 p.m., the sky began to lighten. The deafening roar was replaced by an eerie, unnatural silence, broken only by the sound of rain, the crackle of fires, and eventually the screams of the wounded. In 20 minutes, a modern American city had been transformed into a scene from a war. Survivors stumbled out from whatever shelter they had found into a world they no longer recognized. Streets were impassable, blocked by mountains of rubble. Familiar landmarks were gone. The very geography of their neighborhoods had been violently rewritten. The response began almost immediately, a story of human resilience rising from the rubble. The city's volunteer militias, Light Battery A and the 1st Regiment, were deployed for ambulance duty and to patrol the ruined streets, preventing looting. Ordinary citizens organized themselves into rescue parties, digging through collapsed homes with their bare hands, searching for neighbors and strangers alike. The sheer scale of the disaster was overwhelming. With city hospital crippled, impromptu morgues and triage centers were set up in churches and public halls that were still standing. But alongside this story of heroism, a stranger, more unsettling phenomenon was taking place. The disaster had created a new, morbid industry. In the days following the tornado, photographers from across the country rushed to St. Louis. They were not there simply to document the news. They were there to capitalize on it. They fanned out across the flattened neighborhoods, capturing stark, haunting images of the destruction, the twisted fences of Lafayette Park, the skeletal remains of the Liggett Myers factory, the gaping hole in the Eads Bridge approach, the lines of bodies awaiting identification. These photographs were then quickly compiled, printed, and bound into paperback booklets. They were sold on street corners and in shops across the country as souvenir views of the Great Cyclone. It was the 19th century equivalent of disaster tourism going viral. People who had not experienced the storm's terror could purchase a pocket-sized collection of its aftermath. It speaks to a peculiar aspect of the Victorian mindset, a deep fascination with tragedy and ruin, coupled with a burgeoning commercial instinct that saw even catastrophe as a market opportunity. These booklets, many of which survive in archives today, provide a chilling, curated view of the destruction, turning profound human loss into a commodity. Meanwhile, the U.S. Weather Bureau, the same organization whose policy had kept the citizens of St. Louis in the dark, had to confront the consequences of its own failures. The official investigation was led by the chief of the Weather Bureau himself, Willis L. Moore. The primary government report was authored by the man on the ground in St. Louis, the local forecast official, Harry Crawford Frankenfield. His pamphlet, titled simply The Tornado of May 27, 1896, at St. Louis, Missouri, became the definitive government account. The event was a brutal, undeniable indictment of the no-tornado policy. It forced the nascent science of meteorology to recognize that public safety had to take precedence over the fear of causing panic. The St. Louis tornado did not create modern weather forecasting overnight, but it was a powerful and tragic catalyst for change, a bloody lesson that could not be ignored. I know I've mentioned it before, and I promise not to make a habit of it, but if you're still watching at this point and you haven't subscribed, we must be doing something right. It takes 1 second, and it would honestly help us out more than you know. Your click tells the platform that these stories deserve to be seen. For over a century, the story of the 1896 storm was told in the currency of its time: 255 dead, over 1,000 injured, $10 million in damage. Those numbers are staggering. And yet, they are profoundly misleading. They fail to capture the true economic scale of the catastrophe. They tell you what was lost in 1896 dollars, but not what that loss means to us. Now, that changed in 2001. Two renowned modern meteorologists, Harold E. Brooks and Charles A. Doswell III, from the National Severe Storms Laboratory, published a landmark study. They decided to reevaluate historical tornado events, not just by adjusting for inflation, but by adjusting for wealth. The concept is simple, but revolutionary. St. Louis in 1896 had far less stuff, fewer buildings, fewer homes, less infrastructure than the same geographic area does today. To understand the true destructive power of that 1896 storm, you have to ask, what would the financial damage be if that exact same tornado took the exact same path through the vastly wealthier, more developed St. Louis of the 21st century? The results of their analysis were breathtaking. The Brooks and Doswell study calculated the wealth and inflation-adjusted damage from the 1896 St. Louis tornado at a baseline of $2.9 billion in modern dollars. That number alone instantly placed it among the most economically destructive tornadoes in American history. But even that is a conservative estimate. Other analyses, using different models for calculating wealth concentration, push the figure much higher, some towards a staggering $5.9 billion, as Brooks and Doswell themselves wrote in their peer-reviewed paper. Including an adjustment for growth and wealth clearly shows the 27 May 1896 St. Louis, East St. Louis tornado to be the costliest on record. Think about that. The storm that we remember as a 19th century tragedy is, by the most rigorous modern economic measures, the single most destructive tornado to ever hit the United States. It holds the #1 spot. More damaging than Joplin in 2011. More than Tuscaloosa in the same year. More than any of the infamous outbreaks that have scarred the modern landscape. If that mile-wide F4 vortex were to materialize 6 miles west of the Eads Bridge today, the ensuing destruction would create a financial catastrophe that would dwarf almost any natural disaster in recent memory. The past in this case is not just prologue, it is a forecast. The legacy of May 27, 1896 is written in broken myths. The myth that a great city was too big to be crippled by a storm. The myth that a great river could offer protection. The myth that an engineering marvel could be tornado-proof. One by one, the storm exposed them as foolish and dangerous comforts. St. Louis was the proof, written in rubble and iron, that tornadoes do not respect geography, population density, or human pride. They go where the atmospheric conditions send them. That legacy is not merely historical, it is active. On May 27, 2026, the city marked the 130th anniversary of the disaster. Local news outlets ran retrospectives looking back at the Great Cyclone. And just weeks before that anniversary, on May 15, 2026, the history of that storm echoed in the halls of Congress. U.S. Representative Wesley Bell of Missouri introduced a new piece of legislation, the Tornado Preparedness Act. The bill directs NOAA and FEMA to modernize forecasting and warning capabilities specifically to improve community resilience in high-risk urban areas. Areas just like St. Louis, the catastrophe of 1896 is still shaping federal policy in 2026. A direct line of consequence stretching across 130 years. The Great St. Louis tornado was more than just a weather event. It was a confrontation, a violent 20-minute argument between a city that believed in its own permanence and a force of nature that operates on a timescale far beyond human memory. The scar on the Eads Bridge, the countless twisted iron fences, the souvenir books sitting in archives, the uncounted victims still claimed by the Mississippi, they are not just relics of a bygone disaster. They are a permanent record. A warning, fired from the past, about the profound danger of underestimating the world we live in. The roar of the 1896 storm